Good morning. Welcome to the North Atlantic School of North American School of Internet Governance. You can tell I'm the substitute teacher. My job is conference facilitator. It used to be referred to as a master of ceremonies, but people have trouble with the master term. If you think about it, ringmaster, puppet master, it has negative connotations. The true puppet master is Glenn McKnight, right? As you know, did so much to get this organized and wasn't able to make it the last minute. So my real job is just to be a poor substitute for Glenn. But let's all have our thoughts and prayers for a speedy recovery for him, because he does so much for this community. I want to welcome you all here to the School of Internet Governance. As you might have overheard, there's no password for the Wi-Fi. Just log into the guest, whatever, AU guest Wi-Fi, and there shouldn't be any password. If you pass the restrooms as you came here from the cafeteria, so hopefully you saw that sign. You just head back out there and hook a right, and you'll see the restrooms when you need them. There's lots of opportunities for networking over the different breaks and the meals, etc. So hopefully we'll have a good time and get to know each other over the course of the next 2 days. My job is a fairly pedestrian one, just to try and keep people on schedule and let people know where they need to be. The real jefe here at this conference is Eduardo, who should be making his way up here. Are you gonna start walking? Yes. So the chair of the North American School of Internet Governance, Eduardo Sanchez. Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to give you a official welcome to the our school, and thank you for everyone for being here today. I think he mentioned the bathrooms. You go out, and they're at the end of the hall, and there will be in the breaks are going to be happening here. So there will be some food and other things. I want to really take an opportunity to express our profound gratitude to American University, and especially Professor Derry Colquhoun, who is the person that is co-hosting this. I think you're going to be out there. He has written various books about internet governance and so forth. He will be out there showing the books. So, and Kathy also is there. She has written a book. And please, in the breaks, go out there and see what's there. And if you want to buy books, they can sign it, and you can take a picture with him, or with her, all that. But I have to tell something about our sponsors. We have .pr. .pr is here with us somewhere over here. He's the CCTLD for Puerto Rico always since the beginning. They have provided sponsorship to this school, so we are very happy and we're very grateful that he has done that. And then we have the Public Interest Registry. The Public Interest Registry is the one that has the registry for the .org. Paul Diaz has been the vice president of I think policy in PIR. He will be around sometime today or tomorrow. And and they have been providing also like .pr. They have been a supporter of this school since the beginning, which we started in 2018. There is also the Internet Society of Puerto Rico, which I am part of that organization. Also through the Internet Society, we get some money from the Internet Society Foundation, which are providing support to schools of internet governance all over the world. Some of you might have been in other schools, and they are supporting them there too. And then we have ICANN for sure. Naela, where are you, Naela? Oh, here. She is the VP of Global Engagement in North America, and when you're in ICANN, you will see her around, and Joe Catapano is over here that works with her. And he will be talking about ICANN later in one of the sessions today, so thank you so much. The American Register for Internet numbers, ARIN, who sponsor our breakfast this morning. I don't know if there are anyone here from them, but we thank them again. Yes. The Tech Law Security at American, this is the program, right? Kathleen Hoggins, right? She will be moderating one of the sessions today. The Institute on Disability and Public Policy is a program from Professor Cockburn. The DNS Research Federation, which are not, where are they? Oh, all right, they're there. So I didn't know that you had this organization, and it's very curious that we have DNS, you do research on DNS, and I never heard about you. I mean, personally, I don't know of other people. I heard, but they will be presenting in the school sometime later, and also the American University Governance Lab, also run by Professor Curry. With that, I'm officially open the school today. So a plus, and hopefully you will get some insight on internet governance concepts, and so enjoy your time here and open your mind. We have a very good program for you today. Thank you.
Introduce the keynote?
Oh, sure.
Vice Provost Burley.
Oh, Vice Provost, yes. Let me see that. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry.
There's a program.
There's a program. That's what I'm looking for. I know. It's just I was in the wrong place. We have today a presentation, or is going to talk to us, Diana Burley, who is the Vice Provost for Research in the American University and Professor, School of Public Affairs, and Kogot School of Business. So please welcome her. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am here on behalf of American University to welcome you to our beautiful campus, to our Spring Valley building, and to thank you for selecting us and for allowing us to host this very important school. We are dedicated at American University to inclusion, to equity, to ensuring that there is equal access to technology and to all of the advances in society. And so this conference, this school, is quite important to us because it brings together this notion of technology and the basic infrastructure of all that we do in society, and the idea of digital inclusion and inclusivity. We have an initiative here at the university that is focused on inclusive tech policy, and Professor Cogburn is a very important part of that initiative. And so we believe that the things that you all are doing, the conversations that you will have, the discussions that you will engage in, not just pushing this school and ICANN and these conversations forward, but really are critical to the evolution of society and how we will all work together and live together in this digital landscape that we have. So I am not going to belabor. I'm not here. You're not here to see me. You're here to hear Derek's keynote and all of the wonderful conversations. But I just, again, on behalf of American University, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. And thank you for bringing the wonderful clear air, because it cleared out just for you. So good morning. Have a wonderful time.
Thank you so very much, Diana. And thank you, Eduardo, for the opening to this very exciting two-day conference here at American University. We are excited, my colleagues and I, to contribute to this initiative. And I did want to just take one moment while I share my screen. I did want to just take one moment to thank my colleagues. I happen to be the person who's here, the faculty member who's here representing our collaboration that led to this wonderful summer school. But I wanted to thank, can somebody change this?
He has to stop sharing before you start sharing.
You stop.
I'm going to.
He's going to disconnect from
All right, great. So I wanted to thank my colleagues that are not here, that represent the group of organizations that have come together here at American University. And first and foremost, Vice Provost Burley talked about our Inclusive Tech Policy Initiative. This is something that is really exciting here on campus. It is an initiative, what we call a strategic research initiative, that brings together organizations across campus that are all committed to inclusive technology and policy. And so we have, as participants in that group, Sasha. Sasha is not here today. Kathleen works very, very closely with Sasha. We have Nanette. We have Gary, myself, and Diana that all play a critical role in bringing this initiative together. And Hang, another of our colleagues who we've just found out that we're losing to another university down south. So we have brought together a number of organizations across campus. So my Institute on Disability and Public Policy has played a lead role in this initiative because it's so central to what we're doing. But we also have the Technology Law and Society Security Initiative and our Internet Governance Lab. So all of us coming together to support this really, really exciting initiative. So what I'm going to do today is to spend a little bit of time motivating you to think like I do. That's what all good professors do, right? We want you to think just like we do. Of course, that's not true. But I do want to spend some time helping you think about how important it is in all of the work that you do to think about inclusion. To think about inclusion for persons with disabilities, inclusion for people all around the world, people with different points of view and perspective, people from the global south, a broad way of thinking about inclusion. So for me, oh, I see little hands clapping. Thank you. That's pretty neat. That's exactly what we want to focus on. I wanted to start by saying a little bit about my background and to kind of shape how I got to this focus where I spend so much time on inclusion. So I've been fortunate to have appointments at 3 universities. My first university was the University of Michigan, the School of Information. And there, my career was able to really focus on the use of information technology for inclusion, broadly speaking. I did a lot of work over the years in using information technology for virtual organizations and distributed knowledge production. We had a global graduate seminar between 6 universities. So American University was one of those 6. So American University, Howard University, and the University of Michigan partnering with the University of Fort Hare, the University of Pretoria, and the University of Witwatersrand. And so going back to 1998, we were teaching online this global graduate seminar, and it was phenomenal. And that's just one example of how I used information technology to facilitate inclusion early on. And then I moved to Syracuse University, the School of Information at Syracuse. And at Syracuse, the next big change in my work came with a focus on disability inclusion. So I was already focusing on inclusion, but I was invited by our Vice President for Research to go to lunch with a faculty member that we were recruiting. And this is a name that I'd like you to remember. His name is Peter Blanc. Peter is a PhD and a law professor and has a long focus on ADA and understanding the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Peter was being recruited to come to American University. We should recruit him to come to American University. He was being recruited to come to Syracuse University. And our Vice Provost for Research said, you know, Dr. Cogburn, would you go to lunch with Peter and talk about how supportive our research infrastructure has been here at Syracuse? And I did. And because I had a great fortune to have a lot of sponsored research while I was at Michigan and Syracuse. So I went to lunch with Peter, and Peter said, "Tell me what you do." And so I started talking about how all of the work that we've done, and some of you know this, both from WSIS and ICANN, all the work that we did around the world using information technology to facilitate inclusion. And I talked about global virtual teams and virtual organizations and all of these things. And Peter just sat there and he listened and he said, "That sounds interesting." And he said, "Well, what about people with disabilities?" And I said, What do you mean, Peter?" He said, "Think about this vision that you have of this globalized, connected, hyper-connected world where people can work on virtual consulting teams and apply to a grant and administer a project from anywhere in the world. You can live anywhere you want to. Think about that vision that you have, and if it doesn't include persons with disabilities, and make sure that they can participate, how you're excluding them from that world." And when he said that, as simple as that was, it was like a ton of bricks hit me in the head. And ever since then, everything that I've done has focused on making sure that we include persons with disabilities. And one of the things that you're going to hear me say is that we have so many technologies, so many policies, so many standards, that if we follow those, it's no problem. The world can be, and our digital world can be, completely accessible. If we don't follow those, it's like looking at a blank screen, just looking like that, right? But if we follow those standards, it can be as accessible as possible. So those were two big changes in my career that then led me to American University. And the big shift for me at American University was saying, can we bring all of those things together? So we here at American University, when I first got here in 2009, in 2010, we launched as IDPP, the Institute on Disability and Public Policy, the world's first virtual master's degree on disability and public policy. So we took all that we had learned about globally distributed inclusive education, because we were doing it between South Africa and the United States and HBCUs and Research One universities, all of those things together. And now we said, let's focus on persons with disabilities. And we were at a time when the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was at its very early stages, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. This global policy framework for persons with disabilities, and we said, how can we make sure that more persons with disabilities can understand what their rights are and can engage in the processes locally to be able to advocate for themselves, and if necessary, escalate that up to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and so forth. So we launched this master's degree supported by substantial investments from the Nippon Foundation in Japan, and we launched a Master's of Comparative and International Disability Policy focused on Southeast Asia, the 10 countries of ASEAN, and we provided full scholarships, fellowships for an American University master's degree for persons who were blind and visually impaired, deaf and hard of hearing, and mobility impaired, all from Southeast Asia. And one of the things that this allowed us to do was not only to include those students in our first, American University's first fully online master's degree as well, but we were able to tap into the AU faculty across campus to teach economics and public policy and international affairs, but we were also able to tap into faculty members across the world to teach in this master's program. So one of the people you're going to hear from tomorrow afternoon, virtually unfortunately, because I'd like you to meet him personally, is Ambassador Luis Gallegos. How many of you have heard of Ambassador Gallegos? A few of you. So he's the ambassador from Ecuador, and he chaired the UN convention, the task force, the UN task force to negotiate the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we were able to have him as one of our faculty members teaching our students about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this distributed environment allowed us to be able to bring faculty members like Ambassador Gallegos together. So I just wanted to tell you that little bit about my background to help you see how this is something that you can start to focus on now and you can continue throughout your research and your practice career. So I wanted to share a little bit about my research trajectory in this space as well. So I first started writing about internet governance in 1998. I started thinking about how telecommunications policy was changing. I did a lot of work on regime formation and global governance, and I started to look at this process of how the various actors were coming together to govern this space. And I was particularly concerned at that point about how developing countries and civil society organizations can or cannot, or could or could not participate in that process. And so I was one of the early advocates pushing for what we've started to understand as this multi-stakeholder global governance approach, where it's not just governments, not just developed country governments, but developing country governments, private sector, civil society organizations can all come together. And I meant to highlight that. So if you look at my background, you see that there's experience in not only in academia, but in the private sector, in international organizations, in regional organizations, in civil society organizations. So I kind of felt like I was perfectly placed to talk about multi-stakeholder participation. So I wrote about that early on, right about the time that ICANN was being formed. In 2003, I continued to write about that, particularly concerned again about how developing countries and regions, particularly the Africa region, was able to participate in these processes. And those of you that have participated in ICANN and IGF over the years have known that we have put a particular emphasis on capacity building is one of the phrases that we use. How can we get more people, just like what we're doing this weekend, to be able to go into next week and be more effective at an international conference or at a meeting like ICANN or any of the other global governance processes? That takes capacity building. It takes effort. It takes attention and resources to be able to strengthen those actors to participate. We wrote about the U.S. role in global internet governance. We participated in thinking about how distributed collaboration could affect the global disability community as well. So this was a really interesting article around cyber infrastructure that was reflected in some of the work I was doing with the National Science Foundation on virtual organizations and cyber infrastructure. And then my colleagues and I, Laura Donardis and Annette Levinson and Francesca Musiani, we wrote a book on the turn to infrastructure and internet governance, really talking about the role that infrastructure providers could play in making rules about who has access and who doesn't and what's done with resources and so forth. Slightly before that, in 2006, as a corollary to the International Communication Association annual meeting, we formed GigaNet in 2006. How many of you have been to a GigaNet workshop or symposium? A couple of you. Okay, good. So GigaNet is the Global Internet Governance Academic Network. So there were a number of us that came together in Ratten in Germany to launch this organization. So it was the world's first academic association fully focused on internet governance issues. Highly interdisciplinary, bringing together technical actors, public policy, legal scholars from all over the world to study internet governance. And those of you that haven't been to a GigaNet conference, I encourage you to pay attention to it. Go back to the archives, look at the range of papers that have been included in the GigaNet archives. It's something that I think you will benefit from. And then in 2006, following the World Summit on the Information Society, the Internet Governance Forum was launched, the IGF, in Athens. And that was a phenomenal meeting because it started to bring together all of these activities related to internet governance. And you know, I wrote about the WSIS process in our book on transnational advocacy networks. We've looked at making disability rights real in Southeast Asia. And our most recent book on researching internet governance is also published open access and available for anybody to use thanks to a wonderful grant that we were able to get. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about grand challenges in disability inclusive sustainable development, because it's something I want you to all be motivated about and think about how you can make a contribution. So when we think about grand challenges, this is a concept that has challenged scientific and scholarly communities for decades. And what a grand challenge is one of the ways in which we can harness all of the resources that we have. So grand challenges focus on big, persistent, important societal challenges. And these are challenges that can't be addressed by any one community, any one actor. It requires us to work together. And think about what we do in the ICANN, IGF, internet governance space broadly, thinking about that multi-stakeholder environment, how it requires all of these different disciplines to come together. Even on the scholarly side, legal scholars, public policy scholars, economic scholars, technology scholars, all of these different disciplines coming together. But it also can't be solved just by academia, can't be solved just by governments, just by the private sector, just by civil society. Really requires all of us to come together to solve these kinds of problems. The iconic grand challenge is, of course, the Kennedy, President Kennedy's challenge to launch manned spaceflight and all of the disciplines that came together to make that happen. Grand challenges have focused on things like new ways of teaching and learning, new material science and robotics. There have been development grand challenges launched by USAID. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, really focused on the grand challenge of trying to address poverty and how do we bring all of the resources together that we need to address poverty. But one of the things that you might find interesting, and I'll hit a little bit harder later, is that the Millennium Development Goals made absolutely no reference to persons with disabilities. So you're trying to eradicate poverty, recognizing the number of persons with disabilities that are in countries that are emerging, that are themselves living in poverty, and it did not recognize persons with disabilities. So when the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, succeeded the MDGs, it did have a focus on disability, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about how that arrived as well. So the last sort of foundational element I want to talk about is Amartya Sen. So how many of you know Amartya Sen's work? A couple of hands. So this book, Development as Freedom, to me is phenomenal. And some of you may know that he won the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel Prize for Economics. And the idea about development as freedom. So does anybody know the sort of core change in how we think about development came about as a result of Amartya Sen? Anybody have a sense? So prior to Amartya Sen, we talked about development mostly in terms of GDP, how much economic growth was happening in a country. And of course that's important, but all of us know, is that the only thing that's important when we think about development in a country? No, it's not. Just like when we think about the internet and internet development, just looking at penetration rates and so forth, that's not enough to think about development with the internet. It's not enough just to think about the pipes. We have to think about the water, right? We have to think about what goes through the pipes. How do we use that to achieve what Amartya Sen talked about, which is broad-based socioeconomic development, education, healthcare, access for women to education, life expectancy, all of these different ways of thinking about development holistically. And he was able to say, with this idea of development as freedom, is that the more developed a country is, the more freedoms it allows. The more freedoms you have, everybody in that country has, to choose where you go to school, where you live, where you work, to live independently, to access transportation, to play sports. The more developed a country is, the more you have the ability to choose. So his idea of development as freedom was very powerful. And he also talked about unfreedoms, barriers. So we looked at this room, and I saw my friend here. I don't want to embarrass you, but I wanted to make a comment. Unfreedoms, barriers, make it difficult for you to do whatever it is you want to do. So if you build a room like this, where the main seating area is down here, down a set of 6 stairs, and you want everybody to be able to come in here and participate, you've put barriers in place. Those stairs are unfreedoms. Now, that's addressed by having an accessible elevator right on the outside, but you probably could have designed a better access to this room if you were thinking about the needs of persons with disabilities, right? That happens all the time, where the accessible entrance is around the back by the trash cans, right? Because you didn't think about the needs of persons with disabilities. So Amartya Sen and this idea of development as freedom is critical. And I was so happy that my friend and colleague, Victor Pineda, actually knows Amartya Sen, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Victor as we go along. But the fact that Sen's work is so central to this idea of what it means to be inclusive, that I wanted to highlight his work. So let's talk about disability and development. That's what we mean by grand challenges. Everybody follow that so far? That we need all the disciplines, all the stakeholders, all the sectors to be able to come together to address big problems like inclusive technology and policy and inclusive internet development, all right? We need everybody. We need all these ideas to come together. So now let's talk about disability and accessibility. So why should we care about this? And Vice Provost Burley and I were at a meeting last week, and she got to hear me tee this up, because I talk about 3 rationales for why you should care. The first rationale is that it's the right thing to do. So in 2011, there was a landmark study that came out, published by the World Bank and the World Health Organization, called the World Disability Report. When that report came out, it sort of startled everybody, because it found, the World Bank and the World Health Organization found that there were more than 1 billion people in the world living with some form of disability. At the time, that was about 10% of the world's population living with some form of disability, much higher than we thought. Now the number is 1.3 billion and about 16% of every country's population. So the numbers are huge. In the US, some of the numbers suggest as high as 23% persons with disabilities. So we think that these numbers are low and undercounting, and they're still staggering. So it's the right thing to do. Many persons with disabilities are living in developing countries, and so just by thinking about the number of persons with disabilities, we should care about and engage in disability. Look at those numbers, and look at the environment here. These numbers mean that out of all of us that are here, most of us either are a person with a disability, we either have a disability ourselves, we know somebody with a disability in our family or somebody close to us, or we will become disabled in our lifetime. And that could happen over time. Some people are born with a disability, some people develop a disability over time, right? You could trip and fall down the stairs and now suddenly need to be using a wheelchair. You might be mobility impaired either for a short period of time or a long period of time. You might wake up, and this has happened to some very prominent people, and something has happened and you can no longer see. Your vision may continue to degrade. Your hearing may continue to get worse. And so this could happen to any of us. So it's the right thing to do. The second rationale is an economic rationale, that people with disabilities and their families will make decisions about where they apply for jobs, where they apply for university, or where they apply to work in a civil society organization, where they shop. If your website is not accessible, they will choose to go somewhere else. If your university admissions processes are not accessible, or your conference is not accessible, they'll go somewhere else. So there's an economic rationale to say, let's make our processes as accessible as possible and welcome and encourage persons with disabilities to come. Let me give you an example. So in Ecuador, in Habitat 3 in Quito, 2015 maybe? Somebody check it up. Look at it. Look up your internet devices there and tell me. Habitat 3 in Ecuador, I think it was 2015. One of the things that they did that I thought was phenomenal, How many of you have ever used mapping software to get around a city or something like that? How many of you have used things like Open Table to make reservations, things like that, right? So think about a person with a disability trying to get around a city, a town, or make reservations, and wondering, if I make a reservation at that restaurant, can I actually get in? Is there an accessible entrance? Is it bright enough for me to be able to see my sign language interpreter's hands? Or can I hear, all kinds of things. So there's a set of mapping applications that are designed now to map spaces for accessibility globally, and to make a global database available. So if you're trying to decide, if I want to go to that restaurant and I have my particular needs, can I go to that restaurant? Is that something I can recommend? So Ecuador, that was hosting this conference in 2016. Thank you, I was pretty close, 2016. Decided, if you're going to be inviting 10,000 advocates, disability advocates, and others to come to town, why don't we use that as an opportunity to map Quito? So they had a mapathon. And so they invited all these UN delegates to use the app to map the accessibility of all these restaurants and parks and so forth. And it built up the database for accessible restaurants, accessible everything in Quito. And what do you think they did afterwards? Remember, this is the economic rationale. They started to market Quito as a disability accessible tourist destination. To say, come to Quito. You know exactly where you can go, where the spaces are that you can go and so forth. So there's an economic rationale. And you want to harness the talents of persons with disabilities. So now, if the moral rationale doesn't move you, and the economic rationale doesn't move you for why we should include persons with disabilities, there's the hammer, the legal rationale. It's the law. So in the United States, we have a whole series of policy and legal frameworks that make it required under certain circumstances for qualified persons with disabilities and to enter the university, or anybody to enter public spaces and so forth, because we have an Americans with Disabilities Act, which is in its 25th year, I think it is now. We have Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act that talks about electronic resources and so forth. So it's the law. So there's a rising set of legal challenges to universities and organizations that say, hey, wait a minute, I'm qualified to go to your university, and your admission process is not accessible. I can't even see the button to push to submit my application. I'm going to file a lawsuit against you. I'm going to ask you to change it first, but I'm going to file a lawsuit against you. I come to your university, and here you are having all these videos, and none of it's closed captioning. I'm going to file a lawsuit against you. So that legal hurdle or hammer is there because you have to do it. And if you don't, under certain circumstances, you're going to face these legal challenges. Now, one of the interesting things is that globally, so that's the legal infrastructure in the United States, but globally, that infrastructure is being now spread around the world through the use of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the CRPD helps us to understand that persons with disabilities around the world are facing barriers in transportation, information and communication technologies, education, employment, political representation, all of these areas. And we also recognize that for each of those barriers, there are solutions, the grand challenges that we talked about. If I were a young person and not looking towards the end of my career, I would be so excited about all of the things that I could build, right? All the technologies I could use to overcome some of these problems. So if you think about the challenges, so when I look at challenges, I look at the opportunities. What can we do about that? So if you look at the challenges to transportation, where persons with disabilities can't get on the bus, can't get on the subway, can't buy a ticket, those kinds of things. How do you overcome those? Lots of technologies that can address those challenges. Let me give you one other example. When you travel internationally, let's imagine you're a person who is blind or visually impaired, and you want to pay somebody for, you give them some currency for a service they provided, and they give you change back. And they tell you they've given you 10 euro back. How do you know that they've given you 10 euro? Unless, somebody's there to help you or something like that. You're trusting them, so you can't be very independent if you're just trusting them. Well, there are technologies that let you pick up your smartphone, scan that currency, and it will tell you what currency it is and in what denomination. That's a cool feature. Those kinds of technology features are absolutely amazing. And in each of the areas where there's a boundary or a barrier, there are technological solutions that either exist or that we can address them. So for physical mobility impaired disabilities, we have ramps and curb cuts and touch screens and so forth. A lot of this comes from the architectural concept of universal design. So with universal design, you design things that are accessible, but they benefit everyone. So going back to this room. So I pointed out an accessibility barrier in this room for a person that's mobility impaired, that's using a wheelchair or using a cane to get in. It's hard to get in this room. Well, what if you're pulling your bag from the hotel and trying to get down here? It's difficult for you too. If you're pushing a baby stroller and trying to get in here, it's difficult for you too. So curb cuts and doors that open automatically benefit all of us. So when we think about universal design, we design that way. I'm part of something called the Universal Design Commission, and we've developed a set of standards for buildings. And let me just give you another example. So if there was an emergency right now, we would probably hear a sound, a buzzer that would go off, and that might be it. So that's great for people that can hear. But if you can't hear, how do you know what's happening, right? So you need a visual indicator as well. But if you can't see, how do you know, that there's an emergency? So the idea is to think through all of these issues as early as possible. So for people who are blind and visually impaired, there are audible symbols for things that we need. There are screen readers. For some people, in this, I don't know this audience in particular, but some people sit here and they say, I'm so curious. I wonder how a person who's blind uses the internet. Have you ever wondered that? How does that happen? How do they use the internet? Why are we talking about making the internet accessible to persons with disabilities? A person who's blind, how can they use the internet? Well, they can use screen readers. Screen readers are so powerful if the technology and the information is designed appropriately. A person who uses a screen reader can access digital information faster than you can with your eyes. So how many of you have ever heard a person listening to a screen reader? Yeah? Now, I'm going to ask that slightly differently. How many of you have heard it the way that they listen to it, not the way that they adjusted it for you? So some of you. So if you're trying to show somebody a screen reader, you have to slow it down for it to be even perceptible in terms of what's happening. But if you listen to it the way that a person who's blind uses a screen reader, it goes so fast. And I see my friend, you've heard it, right? And you're just like, what are they doing? But they can go through the whole website, and they know when to push a button, what content is there, how to jump around the website, if it's designed appropriately. If not, it's like this. Nothing. So it goes from being able to access the information faster than you can to nothing if you put the barrier in place of not following the standards. It's amazing, right? So people who are deaf and hard of hearing, there are also solutions for what they face. So visual alarms and signals, virtual sign language interpretation, AI-based sign language interpretation is on the horizon as well. So all of these solutions, these grand challenges, are augmented by the CRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this was the first treaty, human rights treaty of the 21st century, and it's also a development instrument. So let me just kind of say that again. This is a global treaty that has dual purposes. It's a human rights instrument. So the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights administers this treaty. It's a traditional human rights treaty with all the protections, the local independent evaluation, everything that goes, the Paris principles, everything that goes along with a human rights treaty is the CRPD. But it's also a development instrument. And it's the fastest growing treaty in history. 186 countries have fully ratified the CRPD. 104 countries have ratified something called the optional protocol, which strengthens it even further. So look at this from Article 1 of the CRPD. To promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. That's a huge ask, right? And so the CRPD helps us to move from historically what was called a medical model, a charity-based, poor you, let me see what I can do to help, I'll let one person in, or I'm gonna try to help you if I can. You know, charity is good, charity is a good thing, but the idea of having to rely on somebody else's goodwill for your fundamental human freedoms, not so good. So this treaty represented a shift from this medical model to a rights-based social justice model, that a person with a disability has the right to education, the right to employment, the right to transportation, the right to a whole series of rights in different areas. So this is the CRPD. This is what the CRPD covers. 50 articles. So think about what you're interested in. See if you can find it here, right? Women, children, legal representation, employment, information access. All of that is represented here by the CRPD. Almost every area of human existence is represented by the CRPD because persons with disabilities are represented in everything that we do, or should be. So there's a phrase in the disability community which is nothing about us without us. Don't do anything without thinking about persons with disabilities. And they've adopted that phrase from nothing about us without us to nothing without us, because persons with disabilities should have access to everything. So in our work, we focused on some of these more than others. So Article 8 focuses on awareness raising. And I like to show this to students sometimes because I like to think about, may I ask somebody, Kathleen, you think I could get some water, please? Thank you. I like to ask students to think, and I'll go back to this list for a second, to think about if you were doing research, thinking about a long-term project, could you find space within this to do research? So awareness raising, if you look at each one of the language in the CRPD is so evocative. So it's encouraging states parties to raise awareness through society and at the family level to foster respect for the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities, to combat stereotypes, prejudices, and harmful practices, and to promote awareness in the capabilities and contributions of persons with disabilities. So think about all of the countries and all of the projects where you could be raising awareness about persons with disabilities. Campaigns for the contributions that persons with disabilities have made. Ways of reducing stigma around persons with disabilities. Accessibility, Article 9, focuses on both electronic accessibility and physical accessibility. So you could be conducting audits of physical spaces that are around you and audits of digital and electronic information. For all of your organizations, you should already be doing that. You should know how accessible is your website. How accessible is your digital infrastructure? You should know so that you know what you need to do to address it. So every one of you should be doing that. Article 21, freedom of expression. Are you allowing people to communicate in the languages that they're most comfortable with, right? Are you providing, thank you so much, Kathleen. Are you providing sign language interpretation? Are you providing multilingual content? Are you providing clear and easy to understand versions of complex work that you produce? Article 24, education. This drove a lot of the work that we did with our virtual master's degree, inclusive education. Article 29, participation in political life. And one more that I've been focusing on is Article 30 on access to sport, recreation, and leisure. That everybody, including children, should have access to sport, recreation, and leisure. So this idea of a no-gap policy, I'm going to move along because I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. The no-gap policy is just like our multi-stakeholder policy, our multi-stakeholder approach in internet governance. Nobody can do it alone. To think about a person that needs to live independently, be able to have transportation independently, work or go to school someplace independently and accessibly, have recreation and leisure independently. All of those things are done by public sector, private sector, NGOs, state, local, federal, international, all different levels. And so the convention has convention bodies like the Conference Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that is able to hear complaints at a national level. So if a country has ratified the optional protocol, remember I said that a person can elevate their complaint. They can actually make a complaint directly to the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities if the country has signed the optional protocol. So, and we've done some work looking at implementing the CRPD throughout ASEAN, throughout Southeast Asia. There are a lot of regional initiatives that have tried to localize the approach to the global CRPD. And one of those that I particularly like is something called the Make the Right Real campaign for the Asia Pacific, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So the sustainable development, so I want to talk just briefly about these other global strategic frameworks, because I think that this helps us to see the interrelationship between a number of other areas that are important to us on a daily basis. So if we move from the CRPD and we go back to the SDGs. So remember when I talked about the Millennium Development Goals. So how much was disability mentioned in the Millennium Development Goals? Zero. Not one word. So now I'm telling you, 10%, 16% of the world's population, and you're not mentioning them that at all as you're trying to achieve development goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals, as a result of pretty aggressive advocacy through transnational advocacy organizations related to disability, and we study carefully 5 different transnational advocacy organizations in disability, we're able to get 11 references to persons with disabilities in the SDGs. 11. Now that's important. I know some people don't think these international treaties and strategic frameworks have any value whatsoever. I get that, and I can argue that too. But to think about how a tool like this can bring the world together, can help achieve this grand challenge of bringing different forces, public sector, private sector, NGOs, all together, at least pulling in the same direction, I see value there. And to have disability as a target in Goal 4, Goal 8, Goal 10, Goal 11, and Goal 17 is really huge, right? So education, employment, inequality, cities, and then also how do you implement the SDGs. So the World Summit on the Information Society that we talked about earlier, and I talked about the work that we did there, and the Internet Governance Forum that came out of the WSIS. When WSIS ended, there were WSIS action lines, and you're going to hear tomorrow from the ITU Director General, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, because the ITU was at the center of this process of leading the World Summit on the Information Society. And when it finished, it had action lines. And there's an interesting overlap between the WSIS action lines and the SDGs. And so we can think about where technology can achieve those development goals and how that technology is accessible to achieve sustainable, inclusive, sustainable development goals. This is a really nice website. If you get a chance to look at it, it's sort of hidden a little bit down here, but it's, I can send it to everybody. But what this does is it lets you look at the relationships between the SDGs and the WSIS action lines. We also have things like W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative. So there are a couple of things that are important here. One is the set of guidelines that are promoted for web accessibility. So another acronym I'll throw at you is WCAG. Does everybody here know WCAG? Some? Good. So WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And for a long time, WCAG 2.0 was the standard for thinking about all digital information, making it accessible. The newest is WCAG 2.2, I think it is. WCAG 2.2, which is slightly more advanced. But if you want to not have your website or your digital information look like this, you follow the WCAG standards and it looks like this, right? It's fully accessible. I'm just doing that for dramatic purposes. I don't know how accessible this is. But so there's a policy, there's a standard, a set of standards to follow to make your technology accessible, make your app accessible, make your website accessible, make your documents accessible. So if everybody's trying to be helpful and you write this cool report and you want everybody to see it and you put it out and you don't follow WCAG standards, you're excluding people who are blind and visually impaired, right? Right off the bat. You put out your video, you don't make it accessible, you're excluding people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So we have policies and standards that we can use. And as I mentioned, the Make the Right Real campaign to me was an incredibly interesting regional initiative. So for the Asia Pacific region, they developed something called the Incheon strategy to make the right real. What do you think the make the right real refers to in this strategy? What's the right that they're talking about?
It's about the digital right for the person with disability.
Okay. Anything else? That's definitely part of it. Make the right real.
It's not only about the strategic, only the innate strategy, but to come in that action or to make it in implementation so that it could be in practical.
Okay, absolutely.
Right.
So let's build on that. So when I talked about the CRPD, what was the CRPD about? Rights, right? But was it just about one right? It was about 50 sets of rights, right? So this campaign was about making all of those rights real, not just on paper, not just on a treaty that 182 countries have ratified, but making it real down on the ground. You know, it's so interesting to me, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How many of you have read it? It applies to everybody in here, right? But most people have never read it, have no idea what the UDHR is, right? So persons with disabilities that haven't read the CRPD and don't know what their rights are, don't have the ability to advocate for those rights. And allies who want to help persons with disabilities who don't know what those rights are can't advocate for them either. And so the Make the Right Real campaign is to say, let's get it all the way down to the ground at a regional level so that people know what their rights are, they can advocate for those rights and try to make them real. So another big development is around cities, inclusive cities. So you've already seen in the SDGs where cities are trying to be more accessible to persons with disabilities. Well, Habitat 3 took that a step higher. So Habitat 3 developed something called the New Urban Agenda. And the New Urban Agenda has a very interesting way of incorporating the needs of persons with disabilities. I've been very close to a lot of these initiatives, and one of our AU alumna was in Surabaya, Indonesia, when this final draft of the new urban agenda was being developed, and helped to get those rights for persons with disabilities included in the new urban agenda. So that advocacy on the part of disability rights organizations have been critical. And then lastly, we've talked about cities and making cities inclusive and accessible. And lastly is disaster risk reduction. So global warming is real. My colleagues who don't believe that notwithstanding, the last few days have helped us to see how real some of these threats are. But all of the natural disasters that we've encountered, Katrina, Andrew, Henry, whatever, all of these different storms that are increasing in intensity and frequency are causing more and more natural disasters. And even here in the United States, under Katrina, the number of persons with disabilities that struggled in that process, couldn't get out of buildings, couldn't get out of nursing homes, couldn't get into shelters. And this is happening around the world. Natural disasters are increasing all around the world. So the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction came out of the Sendai conference, which was in Sendai, Japan. And the Nippon Foundation, which has supported a lot of our work, supported that conference to make it the most accessible UN conference in history. And so I always like to tell people that are organizing conferences, if you want to think about making your conference accessible, look at how the Sendai conference was organized and replicated, which they had a lot of money to make it accessible. But this is everything from registering for the conference. So the website to register has to be accessible. When people get to the airport, do they have accessible transportation? When they're going to hotels, do they have accessible hotels? Is the conference venue accessible? Do you have it clearly marked? Where are the accessible entrances if you do have an alternative around the corner by the trash cans? That was nasty. So making the conference, all the conference information that gets produced, all of that has to be accessible. The sessions have to be accessible. If a person is a wheelchair user and they come in here, where do they sit? Right? I think it is possible, but you've got to think those things through. So before the Sendai conference, one of the other things that I was so proud of is another transnational advocacy network we work with. I love my acronyms. DIDRRN, the Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction Network, met in Dhaka to say, let's first, before the conference, let's promote a series of disability inclusive principles that can be incorporated into the global framework on disaster risk reduction. And it was. So this is just fantastic. And I just wanted to end by saying that after Sendai, which I think is a major strategic framework to think about older persons and persons with disabilities, they have an annual, now become biannual follow-up called the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction. So the first one post-Sendai was in Cancun, Mexico. So the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction asked us at IDPP, would we come to help make that conference accessible like the Sendai conference was accessible? We said, no, we don't have all those resources to make the conference accessible, but we can help you. And what we decided to do was to help make it accessible, but also to study the use that information technology could play in making that conference inclusive and accessible. So we have a paper that's on the web, you can find it, called Beyond Being There for All of Us, comparing web conferencing and mobile remote presence devices for accessible participation in global governance. So Beyond Being There comes from a famous study by Stonetta and Holland in the world of computer-supported cooperative work in 1992 about how do you use technology to facilitate people projecting presence at a distance. So Beyond Being There. So the focus on just trying to get everybody in the same room was what everybody used to focus on. How many scholarships can you provide to get people in the room and so forth. So this article back in 1992 talked about how do you go beyond being there. You're never going to get all the right people in the same room at any given time. So how do you use technology to facilitate distributed collaboration so that people can participate? So the National Science Foundation took up that name and its blueprint on virtual organizations as socio-technical systems, and I helped to participate in that process. And so we wrote this article called Beyond Being There for All of Us. And we used this as a platform to study the role that web conferencing could play in a major global governance process and telepresence robots. So if you look at this picture here, you might find this room familiar. Does that look familiar? Why? It's right here, right? So this is not Mexico, right? So we were getting ready to go to the conference, and we decided, my office is right down the hall, we decided let's practice what it would look like to have a mobile remote presence device be able to be at a conference, and people could connect to it from anywhere in the world and be able to see what's going on. Yeah. So we got a friend visiting us. This happens to be me because we didn't plan appropriately. But a person anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world with internet access, and it doesn't require super high bandwidth, could participate in this process by using a mobile remote presence device. And I'm going to take a picture of Dr. Burley. Gotcha. So we studied these telepresence robots in Mexico at the Global Platform for Sustainable Disaster Risk Reduction. We had 4 of these robots, and we had 4 remote hubs. And those of you who participate in ICANN and IGF, you're now familiar with remote hubs. I was there for the beginning of that, having remote participation in these kinds of meetings and so forth. And this remote hub idea makes a lot of sense. You could have people gather here who couldn't go to Mexico, but could be in a conference room like this and could participate in Mexico, but they could also listen to the presentations and so forth, but they could also talk amongst themselves, right? So you could have local experts and local subject matter experts talking about what's going on in the conference. So the idea of remote hubs makes perfect sense. So we had 4 of these, 4 remote hubs, Dhaka, Fiji, Brussels, and AU, DC, and we were able to connect disability advocates from around the world to the conference in Mexico. And you can see all 4 of them, how cute they looked in their little shirts. And then the ones from Fiji, they put on a cool shirt right here to make it look a little bit more local. Now this picture, Dr. Burley and I got a chance to talk about this. The person speaking to them is Dr. Amina Mohammed, the UN Deputy Secretary General. And she was at the conference and she said, I sure would like to meet, these people, all over the world, but she's got a busy schedule. She said, if you can get to the top of this escalator, I'll have a few minutes. Her chief of staff told us this. If you can get to the top of the escalator, I'll have a few minutes to talk to them before my next meeting. So with a web conference tool, you couldn't have done that. You would have had to be in a specific room somewhere. Can you get her into the room? She said, no, you got to come to the top of the stairs. So all the robots were running to get to the top of the stairs. And when she got to the top of the stairs, she was greeted by these robots all saying hi from all over the world. And she started talking to them. And she said, wow, this is amazing. So later in her presentation, she said, I have just seen the greatest single example of technology for enhanced participation and development that she had ever seen, or some phrase like that I tried to capture. So it was just phenomenal. I'm happy to tell you more stories about that. And I'm going to close now by just inviting you. I know everybody has a busy week the rest of the week, or what's today? This is Saturday, next week. I can't be with you at ICANN because I'm going to New York tomorrow to the UN for the Conference of States Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is my first time back since COVID, and I'm really excited to regather with my colleagues there. So for the last couple of decades, I've had to wrestle with, do I go to ICANN, IGF stuff, or do I go to disability stuff? And I started off with ICANN and IGF stuff, and then I started to move more for many years into the disability space. And now I'm kind of going back and forth, but it's hard sometimes when they happen exactly at the same time. So I won't be able to be at ICANN, but I will be at the UN. But if anybody, move that thing. Please move that.
It'll go away.
Yeah. So if you want to register virtually for our side event, we're going to have a side event on children with disabilities beyond representation, this idea of kind of make the right real. So we're going to have a panel on Thursday morning that looks at what are some of the things we can do to make this right real, not just on paper. And I'm going to focus on Article 30 on making the right to leisure, recreation, and sport real for persons with disabilities. How do we do that? So I'm a sailor, I'm a boater, and so I'm going to talk about inclusive sailing and how you can modify sailing and sailing instruction and practice to be accessible to persons with mobility impairments and various kinds of disabilities. And I'm going to talk about ways in which you can modify sailing and sailing training for children with learning differences to be able to adopt these STEM principles and be able to go out on the water and take their parents out on the water. So I'm really happy to have had this opportunity to kind of set the context for what we want to do here for the next 2 days, and I look forward to any questions that you might have. So thank you.
There's one question in the chat from Stacy. Everybody can hear me. You mentioned AI. What do you see AI accomplishing for the disability community in the next few years?
Please tell Stacy I'll send her a check tomorrow. I wanted to talk about AI. I didn't have it on my to-do list for today. AI is something that I'm very passionate about. It's something that I know many people are concerned about and thinking about. I'm just joking, of course. I have no idea who Stacy is. I just want to be clear. I'm an academic. AI is incredibly important to everything that we've talked about. And like everything that we've talked about, if anybody wants to play with the robot, you can drive it around. Anybody want to take first crack? You want to hand that back? Thank you. You should be able to just drive it around. You can just push the buttons and drive it around. Like everything that we've talked about that has both pros and cons, we're concerned about what's happening with AI as well. So particularly generative AI, and we'll talk about this. Certainly on the sign language interpretation and avatars, it's getting more and more able to make better predictions about what words are coming next and so forth. So having virtual sign language avatars is something that's happening. We're doing a lot of work personally here at AU and my team looking at the ways in which AI can help measure the progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, because we're at the halfway point for the SDGs, and there are not any really good measurements of how much progress we're making, including for persons with disabilities. So I could go on and on about that, but AI certainly has a role to play in this space, and it's something that we should continue to be careful about as well. Other questions? Yeah.
Hello.
I don't think it goes up.
It is for Zoom.
It's for Zoom.
Okay. Oh, it's not for the. Okay, the accessibility engineering in United States impresses me quite a lot.
I didn't hear the first part. I'm sorry.
The accessibility engineering that I see in United States, the elevators, escalators, and so on, for a person coming from India is quite impressive. But at the same time, you were talking about global policy framework on accessibility. Why is this level of sensitivity and the degree of engineering not there in other countries, many other countries? I come from a country where the hospitals are very well equipped, and I've seen orthopedic hospitals in a city which is a well-equipped hospital, that is not accessible. That probably expects an injured person to climb upstairs. And so that is the first part of my question.
Yeah.
And the other question
So why don't
is
we just take that one, just to make sure. So I'm assuming everybody could hear online as well. So only online. Yeah, maybe so, exactly. I'll repeat again. Yeah. So the question is really, oh, he was doing a wheelie right there. Look at it. Woo. So the question is that the first part of the comment is that in the U.S. there seems to be a high level of accessibility engineering in place in different ways, and why are other countries perhaps behind in that space? And first I'll start by saying, even though it appears that way in the U.S., there are lots of places that are not accessible in the U.S. It's not a done deal here either, and in some cases it's done in a way that is not fully appropriate. Like the example I keep making, here, I'm glad you can get into this space, but you can't do it the way everybody else can. You have to go through this separate entrance and around by the trash cans and so forth. So it's not, but it's better than nothing. So it's good that you have that. But what I would say is that as more countries adopt the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and again, we're at 186 countries now, so almost every country in the world has ratified the convention. Now, the U.S. hasn't. Some of you may be surprised that the U.S. hasn't ratified the convention. We signed it under President Obama, but the Senate failed to ratify it. And what ratification of a treaty means is that a country either has identified that its legal and policy framework is now in place to meet the spirit of what is in the treaty, or it's committing to put in place this legal and regulatory infrastructure. So if you ratify the treaty, now you're giving the community tools to advocate for themselves to then put pressure on buildings, projects, and so forth and so on. So as more countries put in place that legal infrastructure, there's more infrastructure to, like I talked about earlier, the lawsuits, the awareness raising, and so forth. But here's the real key, and this is for everybody. It's far more expensive to retrofit accessibility than to build it in from the beginning. If you build a website and you spend all your time building the website, and as you're building it, you don't spend 1 second thinking about accessibility, I almost guarantee you it will not be accessible. Now that's changing because a lot of the tools that we use nowadays have accessibility features and checkers and so forth built into it. But if you design something without thinking about accessibility, it's not going to be accessible. Whereas if you think about accessibility from the beginning, every time you create a picture, you just quickly put an alt tag on the picture. So you just follow that process, then it makes it accessible. If you're building a new transportation system or a new hospital, and you think about accessibility from the beginning, it will be just built in as a cost of doing business. But if you build your hospital and then say, now let's make that accessible, it's exorbitant. So it's really about thinking in advance of how to make things accessible is what I would say. Let's see if there's others, and then we'll come back to you. Here, here, and here, and I see here. Yep, so here, 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 and here.
Hello. Yeah, Professor.
Could
My
you
name
maybe
is,
hold it just a bit closer?
my name is Sridhi Prayamaji. I'm from Nepal, and I've been very active in the Asia Pacific, region.
Mm-hmm.
And the question that I have is, especially when we talk about multi-stakeholder engagement, what we see is a lot of the times the values are clear, but when it comes to inclusion, people are not so clear about the whole value of how to include people.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, when it comes to giving fellowships, it's always driven to the point where merits are counted. Whereas when you talk about multi-stakeholder concept, it is more about representation. It is more about the the unrepresented people, especially group or sectors. I have done this discussion with the people, and what do you think is the major challenge here? Is it the values or is it the awareness about how we are going to bring those people in? Because ultimately they are part of our society.
Jonathan, are we 10 or 10 or 10:15? Okay. All right, let me take a couple of questions and I'll come back to that. Yep. We'll see if we can.
Making the right.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Professor Derek. This is Bibek from Nepal. So whenever we see the global policy, but at the end, the implementation is at the local level. So while sort of talk about why hospitals are not accessible, these are guided by the local municipal acts and rules. So my question is, how do we fuel this change in local policy and implementation level? And how as a youth we can assist in them? And do you recommend any case studies or research that has, you gave an example of Professor Sen, who said how economy change when you make things accessible. So do you have a certain specific success stories by driving this change by implementation local level?
Yeah, outstanding question. Yep, absolutely. I'll get to that. Let's see if we can just take the other two questions and I'll try to answer all three of them. So we got one here and then over here and then another one right there and another one here. Oh, you're saying bye. Oh, you're saying bye. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor. We talk about disability. How can we engage stakeholder model to resolve disability problem in Africa specifically?
Okay, excellent. Okay, maybe two more and then my mind is going to be overtaxed.
Hello, Professor. My name is Aisha Iftikhar. I'm from Pakistan and my background is purely from academia and research. So I'm a researcher from working at the technical security and policy actually. So there was a question from AI. So I am interested to know if you could share your thoughts on AI, the ethical issues while using AI for maybe for the specially abled people or for the other groups of the society that are actually marginalized.
Sure.
What are the possible implications of ethical issues?
Absolutely,
using AI?
fantastic question. All right, I'm going to have to either get my phone back so I can take some notes or you guys help me remember the questions. I see three that I want to just really jump on. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Cogburn, for the tremendous presentation, extremely illuminating. As a country code top-level domain operator, we have been very much involved in supporting a school from K to 12 for visually impaired individuals, and we are also involved with the Deaf Society in Puerto Rico as well. However, what we have not been able to do is to promote the development of more websites with this type of protocols that can help and enhance the participation of the members of the particular groups. Is there one website where I can find all the different protocols that can make accessibility so that we can augment the accessibility to the various groups, such that we can make that available to other developers to make that awareness very much present to them while they're developing. Because you brought a very important point. It is easier to integrate this in the development rather than having to add it afterwards. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take privilege to just answer these questions because I know we're out of time here. So I want to just answer four of them really quickly, and I'm going to be here for all 2 days. So first on the question about local level advocacy, how do we bring make things happen at local levels, because that's where policy is really happening. And that's something that was important to us when we started the master's program as well, because you want people to understand how to engage with public policy and public policy advocacy at a local level. So it requires training, some training, if you will, in policy advocacy, in sustained engagement at a local level. But we think it's also important to have those local level advocates linked with transnational advocates for a variety of reasons. When the concept of transnational advocacy networks was developed, one of the key concepts that came out of it was the boomerang effect. So there may be some things that are difficult for you to raise at a local level that if you're connected with international or transnational advocacy organizations, they can raise globally about your particular issues that you might not be able to raise locally. And so there's so many of these networks, I can tell you 5 that I'm actively involved with that would welcome persons with disabilities and allies to participate in those networks. And the local level is critical. So at the work that we're talking about on cities, am I looking at the right person? That was your question? No, I don't want you, I'm just trying to find the person that asked the question, yeah. So on the work that we're doing around cities, so we talk about the new urban agenda for cities, but the annual conferences go down to local levels. So we have mayors, there's a network of mayors in local cities where we've tried to focus on these accessible principles at the city level, at the local level. So absolutely on that one. On the youth, on the youth side, there's some really, really interesting examples within those networks of youth organizing as well. So that transnational advocacy, local advocacy and transnational advocacy is what I would focus on. I'm going to come back to AI last. On the website development, so the set of principles under the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is the best place to get the whole list of recommendations. Now, there's an automated checker that you can use. It's called the WAI Access, I think is what it's called. And so you can feed it a URL, and it'll tell you what's wrong. And so then it will identify it for whoever's developing the website to try to fix it, try to address the problems. But I will say, I feel responsible for saying, if you want to do real accessibility testing, you want to go beyond that. And you want to have your website tested by actual users to see how they use it and how accessible it really is. But I know that's an extra effort and responsible. So if you just take the step of using the Web Accessibility Initiative tester, you'll get a sense of what's wrong, and your developer can try to fix it. Now, what if the developer doesn't have the skills to fix it? So there's something called the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and they participate in the CSUN conference every year. So California State University Northridge has a Center for Disability Studies that puts on a conference in San Diego every year. And that group is a international technology and education conference. And out of that conference was born the need to train more people who can do accessibility testing and remediation. So they created this association, and it's phenomenal. They have a training path and a track that you could send people to get that certification, and then they could do it for you, but they could do it for all of the other websites in Puerto Rico as well. So that might be a good idea. Now, that association has been absorbed by G3ICT, the Global Initiative for Inclusive Information and Communication Technologies. I told you I loved acronyms. So G3ICT has absorbed the International Association for Accessibility Professionals. So I think we could definitely talk about that. And then lastly, on AI and ethics. So I have tremendous concerns, and I can point you to some of the interviews I've given over the last couple of weeks, in particular in the last month or so, around some of these concerns. But what I will say is, you're right to have concerns around the ethics and to try to understand what are some of the ways to move forward. And so a couple of kind of key principles to keep in mind is one, and some of these things are not going to happen, but this is what should happen. So one is that there should be more regulatory guidelines put in place. These companies are not going to regulate themselves. They have talked about how competitive this landscape is, how hard they're pushing in this direction. And they're not going to regulate themselves. So they're asking for regulation. In the last few days, so for the last 6 months or so, there's been a New York Times survey of AI experts that has been talking about to what degree do you think what you're working on in AI could threaten humanity, something like that. And it was about 10 or 15% that said yes, that it could threaten the existence of humanity. That was startling enough, right? But over the last 2 weeks, the heads of all the major AI companies have come out and said, this is an existential crisis, that this has the ability to eradicate humans from the planet if we don't deal with this. And this is not hyperbole. This is moving so fast now, and the models are being trained on so much data that they are as smart as everybody in this room. They can draw on everything that's been written by everybody in this room, everything that's been said by everybody in this room, times a million, a billion. It's drawing on, the models are drawing on everything that has been written. And you need to know what the models are trained on. And there's a whole range of things that are put into the AI blueprint for Bill of Rights, AI Bill of Rights, that we can think about what kind of things could be put in place to limit some of this. I'm going to stop now because I know I'm over time, and I just want to thank you all for that. I'll be here for 2 days, and I look forward to talking to you.
Thanks a lot, everyone. That's the beginning of a 30-minute break. But try to get back here by 11:45, if you would. So for those that are on Zoom right now, time to get up and take a break yourselves. And we'll be back here at 10:45. All right, thanks, everyone. Oh, you want me to change the share? Okay, yep. We should probably give him his laptop back, too.
I think so. I think he shouldn't have any problems. Thank you, Jonathan. He shouldn't have any problems navigating. I leave anything else out there?
I'm looking.
My coffee.
Oh,
Thank
there
you,
you go.
sir.
Yep.
And my dongle. I must have put it in my screen share.
All right, excellent.
Yes, sir.
I'm gonna put a screen that says the time of the meeting, or I have to
Okay. People ones. I'll do my best.
You actually said that the order section is at the end of the introduction. At the very end, you said it's order section. How do we vary with the Bay Area or other regions? I mean, you want to introduce the Eduardo, you introduced the and then you said this time and next Eduardo. China and other regions. So they become just, his name is Eduardo Diaz. Thanks so much for hosting it. Yeah. We're talking about
It's probably beyond the capacity of the hour to handle it. Figure alcohol, whatever would be fine. And of course, I'm going to go with Brian.
So BASIS is another organization within the IGF, ICANN type space.
Yes.
Right.
So, my wife
It's led by the International Chamber of Commerce. Those companies
I wrote for the sake of my marriage.
that they can have a big impact by aggregating that action. So they are very clear about what they want to do.
You're giving a presentation, right? Moderating.
But they want to try to do so in a way that is open and inclusive as possible. Not necessarily because they want to do the right thing. Some do. It's good for the bottom line. So we might talk about the moral rationale or an economic rationale. So for them, it's good for the bottom line. And so, they want to consider greenwashing, from the environmental perspective, or you need a term, a sitting term for accessibility, like you look like you're accessible, but you're not really, that's what greenwashing means.
Is that an area of focus for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one of my legal
I think the idea
It's one of those areas where technology and law intersect.
what their needs are, and to figure out
Back when I
where
was engaged in the quixotic goal of making people better presenters,
because the private sector is very clear.
I did some research into that in order to include accessibility in presentations
I used to
and
work with the global information infrastructure. So you've got AIS, you've got BASIS, business action, information society. Those networks of organizations of the private sector, they work year round.
Well, right, but I mean, normally it'll just give you,
Deciding
tell you
what's in their
yes or no.
interest.
Good
And
one.
then you get into the policy process. This is what's really critical. And I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but I forgot your name. I just saw your face.
And that concept of universal design, I think is a good one, but the truth of the matter is, all of
So
our.
they know what their interests are. And so with some of these conferences and the outcome documents that come out of conferences and so forth. Thank you so much, I appreciate that. So they don't wait until the conference is over and the conference outcome document comes out to try to then react to it. To really have an impact, you get involved in the labs. And so you go to the conferences, but they've already
Test.
they know what their interests are. So they know what they want in the documents and what they don't want in the documents. And so they can engage until they get as much as they can out of that process. Then you have the document.
Not really taking this.
That's what they want.
For me, as a field operating
Multiple choice question in a paragraph.
immediately, we recognize that there is a need to include visually impaired as well as in terms of like slide visuals in the beginning. For example,
For all three reasons, right? For the moral rationale is the right thing to do, but also for this economic rationale.
That's exactly right. They have like their money,
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Sure, my pleasure.
If you have a dense accessible easy to read version of the same
Reservations, rural areas, absolutely.
and motor issues,
Yeah, and so
That result, I believe, is pedagogically 50 years
certainty that, as you say, acres of text, is not going to help someone with a cognitive disability like dyslexia. So they got to manage.
when I talk about that no gap policy and where different actors have to play a role, in the U.S., the National Telecommunications Commission, NTIA, plays a big role, and they're going to talk tomorrow or no, the next panel. Yeah. So these rural strategies, so rural broadband strategies, how do you facilitate internet penetration in rural areas and so forth. I lived in South Africa for 5 years, and one of the strategies there was to use community information centers in rural areas. Community information centers, you know, where the idea was you might not get individual users in rural areas access, but if you could have a center that could get, you could bring access to the center in a variety of ways, and then have that center serve as an access point for persons in a rural area to at least use the, you know, be able to have access and be able to use the content that's there. And then what you're also doing is building up, you're building up a community of users, you know, that can then be, demand, exactly, you're building up demand for the resources, then it becomes economically feasible to bring network out to a rural area. So, now part of how they funded those was through tax on cellular providers. So they created something called a Universal Service Fund that then there was a set of resources to be able to build those community information centers. And I love your question, and because it's something that I've been really, really interested in. So I was at the CSUN conference when this IAAP was formed, and I thought it was such a good idea because the automated systems, one, only go so far, but they certainly can identify what the problems are. But the very next step is, okay, I identified the problems, how do I solve them?
Exactly.
And so you need more people who are trained.
One of the things in Cancun, I was speaking to the operator in Argentina, and she brought a very interesting perspective, which I find, I try to, I shy away from it for other reasons. I dislike very much reaching out to the visually impaired and deaf impaired community to talk about you cannot see it, you cannot hear it. That's not what I want. That's not the conversation I want to have. So I find it very uncomfortable. I don't want to be there. So what Argentina did is they hired a sign like a deaf person.
Right. Absolutely.
As a salesperson.
Absolutely.
Who is reaching out to them and selling to them.
Absolutely.
This has nothing to do with who are you, what are you. No, this is us, this is what we're offering, and here we are for you. And when I saw that, I was like, yes, that's what I want. That's exactly what I want. Because we're already doing stuff with those communities, but I'm not selling to them.
You put your finger right.
And that's when I jumped in and I said, well, wait a minute. These are potential customers. Why aren't we speaking to them?
That's right.
So that's the next step. So I am going to reach out to one of the teachers at the high school level, and we want to hire her. We want to train her. And now you're a salesperson. Now you're a spokesperson to this particular community.
And all I would say is, I think, you know, if we can, you know, think about how, you know, and I'd love to work with you on this, is how we work with your staff.
That was the next question.
Let's get them trained to be able to do this kind of development that is meeting all the standards, because that's what you want to do, meet the standards, because you know then people can access it.
And then, as a CCMSO counselor, I can bring this to the
That's exactly
CCMSO.
right. You can bring it.
And we can, and what we will do is that I can bring this to the regional organization, to the Latin American and Caribbean Top Level Domain Association, like TLD. And we can have this conversation and say, hey, already Argentina is doing it.
That's right.
So maybe we can develop workshops and things like that. And Puerto Rico is right around the corner, literally in terms of geographically, as well as
I love it. I love it.
ICANN 79 is in March. So we might be just in time to do something like this a couple of days before ICANN and have a workshop.